The air was thick with the scent of mahogany and stale cologne as Julia Evans stepped into her father's office for the first time since his death. The office was exactly as Richard Evans had left it. Papers neatly stacked, awards glinting under the soft lights, and the oversized leather chair still angled toward the grand window overlooking the city skyline. Julia's eyes fell on a framed photograph on the desk, the one of her as a child perched on her father's shoulders. The ache in her chest tightened. Richard Evans had been the epitome of power and control. The CEO of Evans Enterprises, he had built his empire from the ground up. But despite his harsh exterior and relentless business acumen, he had always been her protector, her rock. Now he was gone, and Julia was alone. Or so she thought. A low, cold chuckle echoed from the far corner of the room. Julia spun around, her heart hammering against her ribcage. There, sitting casually in her father's chair, was a man she had never seen before. He looked strikingly familiar, yet entirely foreign. He was tall and imposing, with piercing blue eyes that glistened with a cruel amusement. "Comfortable chair, isn't it?" he drawled, swiveling slightly. "Who are you?" Julia demanded, her voice trembling. The man's grin widened. "You don't recognize me, Julia? I guess dear old Dad kept more secrets than you thought." Julia felt her knees weaken. "What are you talking about?" The man stood up and walked around the desk, looming over her. "I'm Bradley Evans," he said, his tone dripping with venom. "Your brother." Julia's breath hitched. Brother? She had no brother. Richard Evans had never mentioned a son. The revelation struck her like a physical blow. Bradley stepped closer, his eyes boring into hers. "Surprised? Well, get used to it, because Dad left me everything. The company, the money, the house, everything." Julia's mind reeled. How could this be possible? How could her father, the man who had always called her his only child, have hidden another child from her? And worse, how could he have left everything to this stranger? Before Julia could form another word, Bradley leaned in, his breath hot against her cheek. "And if you try to fight me, I'll bury you just like Dad." The elevator doors slid shut, trapping Julia in a suffocating silence. Her father's office had always been a place of security and comfort, a place where she was the beloved daughter of the powerful Richard Evans. But now, that sanctuary had been tainted, transformed into a battlefield where she was utterly outmatched. Bradley Evans. The name echoed in her mind like a curse. She hadn't missed the way he had said it, as if it was a badge of power, as if he'd been waiting his entire life to claim that identity. And the way he had leaned in, threatening to bury her just like Dad, that tone was ice-cold, dripping with a hidden malice. Julia's hands trembled as she fumbled for her phone. She had to call someone, anyone. But who would believe her? Richard Evans was a man of control, a man of secrets. Was it really possible he had hidden a son all these years? The elevator dinged, and Julia staggered out into the lobby. The receptionist, a young woman with dark eyes and a tight bun, glanced up from her desk, her face a mask of forced neutrality. Julia caught a glimpse of Bradley emerging from the elevator behind her, his jaw set, eyes narrowed. "Miss Evans," he said, his voice loud enough to echo across the lobby. "Don't forget, the reading of the will is tomorrow morning. I'd hate for you to miss it." Julia clenched her fists. Was he taunting her? Or was there something more he wanted to say? But before she could respond, Bradley turned on his heel and strode away, his polished shoes striking the marble floor with a chilling finality. Julia forced herself to keep moving. She needed answers. 20 minutes later, she found herself standing in front of a dingy, nondescript office building. The sign read, "King and Hartwell, Attorneys at Law." It was a place she hadn't visited in years, the office of her father's personal attorney, Walter King. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust. Walter King sat behind a cluttered desk, his thinning hair combed back and his glasses perched on the edge of his nose. He looked up as Julia entered, his expression a mix of surprise and sympathy. "Julia," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him, "I was expecting you." Julia sat down, her eyes locking onto Walter's. "Is it true?" she demanded. "Did my father really have another child?" Walter's expression hardened, and he leaned back in his chair. "Bradley Evans," he said slowly, as if tasting the name. "Yes, it's true. Bradley is your father's son. He was born long before you were, the product of a brief, tumultuous relationship your father had before he met your mother." Julia's breath caught. Why didn't he tell me? Walter sighed, pulling a file from a drawer and setting it on the desk. Richard was a complicated man. He had his reasons for keeping Bradley a secret. But now that he's gone, those secrets are surfacing. And Bradley, well, let's just say he's not here to make amends. Julia swallowed, her mind racing. "What do you mean?" Walter leaned forward, his eyes dark. "Bradley has been preparing for this moment for years. Your father may have left him everything, but that doesn't mean it's all legal, and it certainly doesn't mean it's over." The morning of the will reading dawned gray and ominous, the sky a thick quilt of clouds pressing down on the city. Julia sat in her car outside King and Hartwell's office building, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. The last thing she wanted was to face Bradley again, but she had to know what her father had truly left behind. Inside the conference room, the air was suffocating, heavy with the scent of coffee and old leather. Bradley was already there, lounging in a chair at the head of the table like he owned the place. He wore a smug, self-satisfied smirk, his eyes glinting as Julia stepped inside. "Well, look who decided to show up," he sneered, crossing his arms. "Ready to hear how Dad really felt about you?" Julia bit down on her tongue, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she took the seat farthest from him, her spine rigid and her gaze fixed on Walter King, who entered the room carrying a thick, leather-bound folder. Walter cleared his throat, settling behind the desk. "Thank you both for coming. As you know, Richard Evans left a will, and as per his instructions, we will now proceed with the formal reading." He opened the folder, his fingers trembling slightly. Julia leaned forward, her heart hammering. "To my son, Bradley Evans," Walter began, his voice carefully neutral, "I leave full ownership and control of Evans Enterprises, including all subsidiary assets, properties, and holdings. Additionally, Bradley is to inherit the estate located at 1845 Ridgeway Drive, along with all remaining financial assets and investments." Bradley's smirk widened, and he leaned back in his chair, eyes gleaming with triumph. Julia's stomach twisted painfully. Everything. Bradley was getting everything. Walter's gaze flicked to Julia, and for a brief moment, his eyes softened. "To my daughter, Julia Evans, I leave a letter, which I have entrusted to Walter King for private delivery." "A letter?" Julia whispered, her voice barely audible. Her throat constricted, her vision blurring. That was it? A lifetime of devotion, a lifetime of being the good daughter, and all she got was a letter? Walter slid a sealed envelope across the table, his expression a mixture of pity and discomfort. "This is for you, Julia. Your father requested that you read it in private." Bradley let out a low, mocking laugh. "A letter? Well, that's appropriate. Maybe he's apologizing for being a terrible father." Julia snatched the envelope, her fingers trembling. "Shut up, Bradley." "Or maybe," Bradley continued, leaning forward, his smile dark and malicious, "he's apologizing for not telling you what a disappointment you were. Isn't that right, Walt?" Walter's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. The tension in the room was a living, breathing thing, pressing down on Julia like a lead weight. Without another word, she stood and walked out, clutching the letter to her chest. Back in her car, Julia ripped the envelope open with shaking hands. The letter was written in her father's bold, slanted handwriting, but the words blurred through her tears. One line stood out, haunting, as though Richard's voice was whispering it in her ear. "Julia, there are things you don't know, things I was too ashamed to tell you. But you need to understand, Bradley is not what he seems. Be careful. Trust no one." Julia's hands trembled as she held the letter, her father's words swimming before her eyes. Trust no one. The warning echoed in her mind, a sinister drumbeat that refused to quiet down. What did her father mean? What was he so afraid of? And how did Bradley factor into all of it? Determined to get answers, Julia headed to the one place she had sworn never to return to, her childhood home. The mansion on Ridgeway Drive loomed like a dark castle against the gray sky, the windows black and unwelcoming. Bradley had already moved in. His car was parked in the driveway, its sleek lines gleaming under the oppressive clouds. Julia hesitated at the front door, her hand poised to knock. But before she could, the door swung open. Bradley stood in the doorway, his expression a mixture of smug satisfaction and annoyance. "Well, well," he drawled, leaning against the doorframe. "Couldn't stay away, could you? Come to beg for scraps?" Julia forced herself to meet his icy stare. "I just want some of my things. Personal things. That's all." Bradley stepped aside, his grin widening. "By all means, take whatever you want. Not that there's much left." Julia's heart sank as she stepped inside. The once warm, welcoming home was now a shell of its former self. Furniture was rearranged, family photos were missing from the walls, and the familiar scent of her father's cologne had been replaced by Bradley's overpowering aftershave. It was as though he had erased every trace of her existence. Upstairs, in her father's study, Julia rifled through the drawers of his old desk. The drawers were mostly empty, but at the bottom of one, she found a locked metal box. The key was missing, but the box was heavy, the contents rattling slightly when she shook it. "What do you think you're doing?" Julia spun around. Bradley was standing in the doorway, his eyes dark and dangerous. "I just want my father's things," she said, her voice as firm as she could manage. This box was his. Bradley's jaw clenched, his eyes zeroing in on the box. "That box belongs to me now." Julia took a step back, clutching the box to her chest. "You have everything. This is the only thing I have left." Bradley moved closer, his face inches from hers. "You have nothing, Julia, and if you keep pushing me, you'll end up with even less." Julia swallowed, her heart pounding. The urge to lash out was almost overpowering, but she forced herself to stay calm. Without another word, she pushed past Bradley and stormed out of the house, the metal box heavy in her arms. Back in her car, she placed the box on the passenger seat and stared at it, her mind racing. What was inside? And why did Bradley seem so desperate to keep it from her? Whatever was in that box, it was important, maybe even important enough to tear Bradley's claims apart. But first, she would need to find a way to open it. Julia stared at the box resting on her kitchen table. Its cold, metallic surface seemed to mock her, as if it held all the answers she desperately needed, but refused to reveal them. The lock was heavy, solid, and old-fashioned, the kind that would require a specific key, or, at the very least, a locksmith with expert skills. But who could she trust? Her father's warning echoed in her mind. Julia paced the room, chewing on her thumbnail, her eyes never leaving the box. Bradley's reaction had been too intense. He wanted this box badly, and that alone told her it was crucial. But why? What did it contain? Her phone buzzed, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Walter King. "Meet me at the Blue Lantern. Urgent." Julia's heart skipped a beat. The Blue Lantern was a dive bar on the outskirts of town, a place she would never have expected Walter to frequent. Why there? And why now? Stuffing the box into a canvas bag, Julia grabbed her coat and headed out. The streets were dark and empty, the rain coming down in cold, relentless sheets. The Blue Lantern was dimly lit, the neon sign flickering like a warning. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale beer and cigarette smoke. Walter was sitting in a corner booth, nursing a glass of bourbon. He looked up as Julia approached, his eyes heavy and haunted. "What is this about?" Julia asked, sliding into the booth, her bag clutched tightly in her lap. Walter glanced around, his jaw clenched. "Bradley's been busy," he said, his voice low. "More than you know." Julia leaned forward, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" Walter took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink. "I started digging around after the will reading. There are discrepancies, transactions, money moving to offshore accounts under names I don't recognize, names that didn't exist until a few months ago." Julia's blood ran cold. "Are you saying Bradley's been embezzling money?" Walter shook his head. "Not just embezzling. He's been setting up shell companies, laundering money, and I think he's been doing it under your father's name. or at least forging his signature. Julia's hand tightened around the strap of her bag. The box seemed to grow heavier with every word. "Why are you telling me this?" Walter leaned in closer, his eyes dark. "Because if you can prove it, you might have a shot at taking him down." Julia swallowed, her mind spinning. "What do you know about this?" She pulled the box out of the bag and placed it on the table. Walter's eyes widened, his face draining of color. "That box," he whispered. "Where did you get that?" "It was in my father's office. Bradley didn't want me to take it." Walter reached out, his fingers hovering just above the box. That box was part of Richard's personal safe. He kept his most sensitive files in there, things he didn't want anyone to see. If Bradley wanted it, it means he knows what's inside. Julia's chest tightened. "Can you open it?" Walter shook his head. "No, but I know someone who can." Julia sat in the back seat of Walter's beat-up sedan as they sped down a dark, empty street. Rain lashed against the windows, and the windshield wipers screeched with every swipe. The air inside the car was thick and heavy, filled with unspoken words and lingering mistrust. "You're sure this guy can be trusted?" Julia asked, clutching the metal box tightly against her chest. Walter kept his eyes on the road, his jaw set. If anyone can open that box, it's Marco. He's the best locksmith in the city, discreet, no questions asked. Julia swallowed, glancing out the window at the passing buildings, most of them boarded up and abandoned. The farther they drove, the worse the neighborhood got. Finally, Walter pulled up in front of a rundown building with a flickering neon sign that read, "Marco's Fix-It." Inside, the air smelled of grease and burnt metal. Marco was a wiry man in his late 50s, with a scraggly beard and eyes that darted nervously around the room. Walter gave him a curt nod, and Marco gestured toward the back room. Julia placed the box on a cluttered workbench, her eyes never leaving Marco as he pulled out a series of tools. "This is a complex lock," he muttered, inspecting the box. "Old, but solid. Whoever made this didn't want anyone getting inside." "Can you open it?" Walter asked, his tone a little too eager. Marco grunted. "Give me an hour." Julia paced the room, her nerves frayed. Every passing second felt like an eternity. What if Bradley found out she had the box? What if Walter was setting her up? And what if the contents weren't what she expected? An hour later, Marco stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. "Got it." The lock clicked open, and the lid creaked as it lifted. Inside the box was a stack of thick, yellowed envelopes, each labeled with dates and names in her father's sharp handwriting. But what caught Julia's attention was a small black notebook tucked beneath the envelopes. She reached for it, her hands shaking as she flipped it open. The pages were filled with Richard's frantic scrawl: dates, times, names, transactions, offshore accounts. And one word repeated over and over: Bradley. Julia's heart hammered in her chest. This was it. Proof that Bradley had been siphoning money, setting up fraudulent companies, and using Richard's name to cover his tracks. But then her eyes fell on a final entry, scrawled hastily in red ink. "Bradley knows. He's coming for me. If anything happens to me, Julia, find the evidence. Protect yourself. Trust no one." Julia's breath caught in her throat. Did Bradley kill her father? "Find what you need?" Walter asked, his gaze fixed on the notebook. Julia snapped the box shut, shoving it back into the bag. "Yeah," she said, her voice tight. "Now I need to figure out what to do next." Julia sat frozen, the phone still in her hand. Walter's message stared back at her like a flashing warning sign. "Meet me at the old office. Bring the notebook. Bradley's moving fast." The old office, her father's first business location before he built his empire. Why there? Julia's gut twisted. Was Walter trying to help her, or was he leading her into a trap? She glanced at the notebook, now shoved deep in her backpack. Her father's frantic scrawl echoed in her mind. Trust no one. But she couldn't do this alone. If Bradley was making moves, she had to know what they were. Julia grabbed her keys and headed for the door, her heart pounding. The streets were dark, the wind howling as she approached the old office. The building loomed like a shadowy relic, its windows dark and empty. Inside, The air was thick with dust and the scent of stale wood. Walter was waiting in the main room, his back to the door. "Walter?" Julia called, her voice echoing. Walter turned, eyes wild, sweat beading on his brow. "Julia," he said, rushing toward her. "Bradley's closing accounts. He's pulling money out fast. We have to move." Julia's hand tightened around her bag. "What do you mean?" Walter glanced around nervously. "Lowry, he's just a front. Bradley's using him to funnel money overseas. If we don't act now, everything will disappear. Do you have the notebook?" Julia hesitated. Walter's eyes were desperate, almost pleading. Was he telling the truth? Or was he part of the setup? Before she could respond, a crash echoed from the hallway. Heavy footsteps. Julia's blood ran cold. Someone was here. "Julia, we need to go," Walter said, grabbing her arm. "Now!" Julia's pulse thundered in her ears as the footsteps grew louder, closer. Walter's grip on her arm tightened, his eyes darting to the dark hallway. "Julia, we have to go," he whispered urgently. Julia pulled away, backing toward the door. "Who is that?" Walter shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know, but if Bradley sent them—" The door at the end of the hall burst open, slamming against the wall. A hulking figure stepped through, his face obscured by a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. "Julia!" the man barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "Come out now!" Julia's breath hitched. It was Bradley. Walter shoved her toward the back exit. "Go! Now!" Julia sprinted down the hallway, her sneakers slapping against the grimy floor. Behind her, she heard Bradley's heavy steps pounding after her. "Julia!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty halls. "You can't run from me!" Julia rounded a corner, her mind racing. Where could she hide? Where could she go? The exit loomed ahead, a red exit sign flickering above it like a warning. She burst through the door and into the alley, the cold night air hitting her like a slap. The alley was a dead end, dumpsters and brick walls closing in on all sides. Before she could turn back, Bradley emerged, his silhouette blocking the exit. "There you are," he said, stepping forward, his eyes glinting under the street lamp. "You just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" Julia's heart pounded. She clutched the bag with the notebook tight against her chest. "What did you do to my father?" Bradley's smile was slow, chilling. "Your father was a fool. He underestimated me, just like you are." Julia swallowed, backing against the wall. "You killed him, didn't you?" Bradley took another step forward, his shadow swallowing hers. "That's the thing about family, Julia. They never see the knife until it's too late." Julia's back pressed against the cold brick wall as Bradley advanced, his shadow swallowing her in the dim light. The alleyway was silent, except for the distant hum of traffic and the slow, deliberate crunch of Bradley's footsteps on the gravel. "You always thought you were the favorite, didn't you?" Bradley sneered, his face inches from hers. His breath was hot and sour. "Daddy's little girl, but you didn't know what he was really like." Julia forced herself to hold his gaze. "I know what you did. I know about the money you stole, the accounts you drained, the companies you bought with his name." Bradley's smile widened, his eyes glittering with cold amusement. "You don't know anything, and you're not going to." Before she could react, Bradley's hand shot out, grabbing the strap of her bag. Julia gasped, pulling back, but his grip was iron. "Give it to me," he growled, yanking hard. "No!" Julia screamed, twisting away. The strap snapped, and the bag fell to the ground. The notebook spilled out, its pages fluttering like wounded birds. Bradley's eyes locked onto it, his expression darkening. "You stupid!" A loud crash echoed through the alley. Julia and Bradley both spun around. Walter stumbled out of the back door of the building, clutching his side. Blood seeped through his shirt, staining his fingers. "Julia!" he rasped, eyes wild. "Run!" Bradley's face twisted with fury. He lunged toward the notebook, but Julia was faster. She dove forward, grabbing it and sprinting down the alley. "Julia!" Bradley roared, his footsteps pounding behind her. Julia's lungs burned as she ran, her feet slipping on the wet pavement. The alley split into two paths, and without thinking, she veered right, plunging into the darkness. Ahead, she spotted a chain-link fence. Too high to climb, too late to turn back. She skidded to a halt, chest heaving, as Bradley loomed closer, his eyes blazing. "End of the line," he said, advancing slowly. Julia clutched the notebook to her chest, her mind racing. There was nowhere left to run. Bradley's grin was a predator's, his eyes dark and wild. He stepped closer, the shadows deepening around them. Julia's back pressed against the chain-link fence, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. "You really thought you could outsmart me?" Bradley sneered, his voice low and dangerous. "You're just as pathetic as Dad was in the end." Julia's jaw clenched, her eyes blazing. "You killed him." Bradley laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the alley walls. "Killed him? No, but I made him wish he was dead." Julia's heart hammered. "What are you talking about?" Bradley leaned in, his face inches from hers. "Your dear, sweet father found out what I was doing, tried to stop me, threatened to call the cops. But when I showed him the proof of his own signatures on those accounts, the accounts I forged, he knew he was finished." Julia's mind reeled. Bradley had framed Richard, made it look like he was complicit in the fraud. "So what? You blackmailed him?" Julia said, voice trembling. Bradley's smile faded, his expression turning hard. He couldn't handle it, couldn't handle knowing his empire would crumble, that his precious Julia would see him for the weak, spineless old man he really was. "You're lying," Julia snapped. "You pushed him too far." Bradley's eyes flickered. "Maybe I did. Maybe I just gave him a little nudge. After all, it was so easy to leave that bottle of pills on his desk. So easy to let him think there was no other way out." Julia's breath caught in her throat. Richard's death had been ruled a suicide. But now, with Bradley's words, the truth hit her like a punch. He had driven her father to it, manipulated him into taking his own life. Rage surged through her. "You're going to pay for this." Bradley lunged forward, grabbing her arm. "No, Julia, you're the one who's going to pay." Before he could wrench the notebook from her grasp, a loud shout echoed through the alley. "Let her go!" Walter staggered forward, blood dripping from his side, a metal pipe clutched in his hand. Bradley turned, eyes narrowing. "Stay out of this, old man." Walter swung the pipe, striking Bradley across the jaw. Bradley stumbled back, cursing, as Julia broke free. "Run, Julia!" Walter gasped. "Get to the police!" Julia didn't hesitate. She sprinted down the alley, the notebook clutched to her chest, Bradley's enraged shouts echoing behind her. She burst onto the main street, headlights flashing as cars honked and screeched. Heart pounding, she ran toward the nearest police station, Walter's voice ringing in her ears. "Get to the police!" She had the evidence. She had Bradley's confession. And now, she was going to make sure everyone knew the truth.